Well, ladies and gentlemen, what is to be gained from taking a little trip down memory lane? Well, in the first instance, of course, although nostalgia isn't what it was once, it's quite funny and fun to indulge in, and so we'll have a little bit of that. But more usefully, a lot of people in this audience won't have experienced most of what I'm going to talk about. And you tend to think, when you come into orthodontics, you're taught this is where we're going, and this is how we get there, and this is the background against which we do it. And you may have some vague knowledge of the steps along the way that led, rather than this situation just arriving de novo, but it may help you if I just pick out one or two steps and say, well, this is where we got to where we are. But more usefully, I think, is if I consider a little bit, well, what caused these changes? Was it because of technical advances in metallurgy and manufacture, scientific evidence persuading us we should change, a change in philosophy, just a change in fashion or financial? Was it suddenly cheaper to make some new appliance or more profitable to use some new appliance? And thirdly, I think, and unless you were there when any of these changes took place, you certainly won't know, and it may surprise you, what were the reactions to some of these changes? Well, what's changed in 40 years, you can sort of divide this up into various categories. The tools of the trade, patients have changed, both in dental disease and their attitudes. Hugely important background factors about how we're paid and the workforce and the need to justify orthodontics. And of course, there wasn't a British Orthodontic Society. I'm going to mainly talk about the tools of the trade, and up at the top there it says orthognathic surgery. I'm not going to talk about orthognathic surgery, but it does just give me the chance to briefly say that this is indeed my last orthodontic presentation. Since I was looking back, I did some adding up. It's my 607th external presentation. But I'm still going to be looking after OPAL, the program which started with orthognathic planning. That's in the middle of a major upgrade. I've managed to get the genius George Chauvet to do all sorts of things to upgrade it, to make customizable analyses, to improve the morphing, to make a more layered interface, all sorts of things. So it's alive and well, and you may, to rather smaller gatherings than this, hear me nattering about that, but otherwise, not at all. But before I talk about tools of the trade and how they've changed, just to give one or two examples of how our goals, where we're heading, have changed. This is a case I treated with upper fours, lower fives, straight wire appliance and headgear many years ago, and a respectable result. But in those days, what you needed to show at any meeting to show that you were a proper orthodontist was that this was functionally correct, that it produced a thing called the mutually protective occlusion, which, for example, in this left lateral excursion meant that only the canine must touch, nothing else. Anything else that touched was deemed an interference, and it would give you temporomandibular joint disease, cause your fillings to fail, bruxism, increased periodontal disease. And so this was the hallmark of good treatment. And I don't suppose most of you in the audience have seen slides showing this for many, many years. And the reason is that it is no longer thought to be of much importance at all. And we'll talk about the reasons for that in a second. But you can see that back in 1989, it was still important, because here I am testing the canine guidance on a rather large and well-known patient on the west coast of America, while David and Bernie and I were attending the AAO. This case, treated with a bag appliance in the late 1970s, looks respectable in terms of the PAR score, but there's something about it that looks old-fashioned and different. And Vince Kokich was the first person to point out that we seem to end up with a lot of cases in those days with the buccal teeth sloping markedly inwards. And the reason for this was, in those days, it was an absolute sin ever to increase the perimeter of the arch as measured through the cusp tips. And so often you were left, if you followed that rule, and it was a rule, with these very inwardly looking tipping buccal teeth. And Vince Kokich said, I don't want any buccal root talk on my prescription for upper canines and premolars. And so had this patient come back in 1980 to see me, then one thing I wouldn't have been able to do is to upright those teeth, because this would have been breaking an inviolate rule. And the rule was based on our thoughts about stability. Anyway, all I did when I saw this patient many years later was just simply round things out. And then, of course, there has been a shift of opinion, not particularly well founded, but as valuable as any other, as to where we should measure the width of arches in relation to the soft tissues. And in those days, it was inescapably across the cusp tips, which makes this look rather extravagant expansion. But when Larry Andrews and William Andrews said, well, no, it's the mucogingival line we should look at, the Waller line, then in terms of that parameter, you can see I've hardly expanded things at all. So way we measure things and the rules or the fashion or the dogma change. This would have been considered immoral, illegal, and fattening 30 years ago, but quite respectable these days. And so that change in a smile would not have been something which would have been approved of by orthodontic teachers back in 1975. So why did those treatment goals change? Was it due to evidence? Well, a bit. There is quite a lot of evidence, mainly in the restorative field, actually, that a mutually protective occlusion doesn't really protect you against anything. And if you make one, it tends not to stay anyway. There's been a lot of research, of course, over the years about stability, and Bob Little showing that whatever we do, the teeth may go crooked, and of course, retention, and Simon Littlewood will talk about that later, has increased its effectiveness. And there's been a lot of increased emphasis on smile aesthetics, looking at buccal corridors and things like that. Some of the research better than others, perhaps overall a bit of a consensus that it does matter, and that the previous end of treatment smile, which I showed you, is preferable in most patients' eyes. Or you could say it's nothing to do with evidence. This is just the swapping of one dogma and one fashion and one person's opinion for another. Or perhaps a bit more positively, you could say that this is part of and reflects a change, an undoubted change, and a right change over those decades to a more patient-centered priority. Now, the patient isn't always right. You know that patients come to you and ask you to do things which, in all conscience and knowledge as we know it, is not in their best interests or their daughters. But nevertheless, we are absolutely right to think more and to research more that we're not doing this treatment for ourselves, we're doing it for the patients. And maybe these examples of changes in treatment goal reflect that as well. There is all sorts of things which I've done and which others in this audience have done and which don't do at all now. Each of these would be interesting historically, but I haven't really got time to talk about any of them. Let's just talk about the basic fundamental, for a start, of our tools of our trade, what's changed in brackets. And this is an extinct form of bracket, except in one or two little microclimates around Adelaide, where it was first invented, nobody uses the beg bracket, really. And I was of the last generation to be taught before the straight wire appliance. And it was plain edgewise or it was beg. And that was extremely instructive. And the beg appliance, produces pictures which look a little bit complicated, weird, and out of control by today's standards. But the beg appliance taught a huge lesson in terms of biomechanics, and that was that if you get out of the way of teeth and stop them interfering with one another or their neighbors or the archwire, they will move with the gentlest of forces. And these days, you tell people, 2-ounce elastics are light elastics. Well, they were heavy elastics. Half-ounce elastics is what we usually started with the beg appliance, and the teeth moved really quickly, as opposed to with plain edgewise. I remember Steve Powell, consultant at Tooting when I was training, saying that edgewise was all grunt and grind, and beg was all nudge and wink. And there's some truth in that. And of course, then you got to this later stage where you had the fun of putting all these little springs and uprighting things, and it was all a bit complicated, especially when a bracket came off or something. But you could usually get the teeth pretty straight. And you're not looking at the respectableness of otherwise of my final arches there. You're looking at those acres of amalgam and saying, good God, never seen anything like that. But that was commonplace. And I can remember coming home from work one day and saying to Lynn, my wife, do you know, you're not going to believe this, but I saw a 12-year-old girl today. She had no fillings and no decay. I know, I've never seen it before in my life. True. And I don't suppose for 1 second we thought about taking out the first molars rather than the premolars, which we did take off. That was a normal amount of decay, and I hope those teeth are still there. But it's just to show one of the things that's changed. You could get the teeth, contrary to some rumor, very respectably straight with the beg appliance. Indeed, with almost any appliance that's ever been invented. It was always possible to get good results. And the beg appliance could move teeth very quickly, a bit excitingly, a bit like driving on ice with rather poor brakes, someone once said, but you could get good results. But the major change, of course, over the 40 years has been this one, and Andrews, having identified ways in which people were failing to get the teeth as straight as they could, developed this appliance, which was pre-programmed in all 3 planes of space. That's a case of mine from 1983. This is Larry Andrews talking in 1989. He's still talking, or was 2 years ago. I was on the same program as him in Florence, talking at CEDO. And in 1989, David Burney and I went to the AAO, where I just took that picture of Larry Andrews, and we took the opportunity to hire a car, go down across the Mexican border to Tijuana, where under the maquiladora system of which Mr. Trump won't be in favor of, come to think of it, but never mind, the straight wire appliance was being manufactured in Mexico. And these ladies, by hand, were individually spruing up all the straight wire brackets to be cast by the lost wax technique, and then to be cut off by hand and polished. And no wonder everybody said, you're mad to think about developing this appliance. You know, first of all, we hardly need it, and secondly, you'll never manufacture it. Luckily, he was obstinate enough to do so, and we have the straight wire appliance, which is, of course, much easier to manufacture these days. This is me on the car we hired to drive down to Mexico. There is almost nothing which I'm entirely certain about. But I'm pretty near 100% certainty in saying that to a clinically and statistically significant degree, the consensus of opinion about the appropriate length of a pair of men's shorts has changed. Has changed since 1989. You might think that when the straight wire appliance appeared, everyone said this is the miracle we've been waiting for. I have to say, amongst younger people who knew no better, that's what was thought. And the only potential negative from those who'd been lucky enough to be well trained, as I was, by Richard Marks in the Begg appliance, was that the teeth were kept in something of a straitjacket. But in fact, the reaction from senior old lags like me, Andrew, was actually much more mixed. They said, well, I don't need that. I can bend wire. I'm good at bending wire. That's what makes me an orthodontist. I don't need someone to bend wire for me. And then, actually, you've sold me a pup. I tried these brackets, and I still need to bend wire. I thought this was a straight wire appliance, and I might as well not have it if I've still got to bend wire. Or, well, I agree with the principle, but I don't agree with the prescriptions. Or, it's expensive. If it saved you any time, that was a non-thought-of thing. So it was far from welcomed by the orthodontic senior skilled clinicians at the time. And they thought, this is going to take a large, complicated stock, which is a bit ironic because I was born into orthodontics just when direct bonding came in. Yes, there was an era of fully banded appliances, and I just escaped. And thank goodness. Direct bonding was, of course, a major change. And, of course, it did away with a huge need to have a large, complicated stock and made the straight wire appliance much easier to have. Had the straight wire appliance been invented 20 years later, then somebody would have said, well, I'm not going to use this because there's absolutely no evidence it's any good because there's no random control trials. And, indeed, I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, there is still no random control trial to compare it with straight edge wise to say it's any better. So you're all using a very unevidence-based appliance. There were case-controlled series, and this one is perhaps the best known, and they found that the cases, the quality of cases, that's all they were looking, the quality of the finish was absolutely no better with the straight wire appliance than with standard edgewise. And Ron Roth wrote an extremely grumpy letter to the AAO and said, well, it's because you're not using it right, and you're not looking at it in the right way and in the right time, and my appliance is hugely superior. I actually played golf with Ron Roth once, and it wasn't only in letters to the AAO he could get grumpy, I can tell you. But, of course, the real reason was they were comparing cases with people who were expert with plain edgewise. It may have taken them longer to do it, but they'd spent a life learning to do it. That's what an orthodontist was. If you did that study now, I think you'd find the straight wire appliance would come out much better because nobody could be expert with plain edgewise. Interestingly, and this is what makes it more relevant to current circumstances, the idea behind the straight wire appliance that you customize the prescription more to individual teeth and individual circumstances, of course, continued, and you can now get multiple prescriptions. And some people react in exactly the same way as more senior clinicians reacted to the straight wire. I don't need those. I can bend wire. And if I have them, I still need to bend wire. And I don't agree with the prescriptions, and it's a large, complicated stock. So history, in terms of human nature's reaction to the introduction of something which is just an extension of the principle of the straight wire appliance, doesn't seem to change over the decades. And of course, the next step, greater customization of appliances. Now with technology both on the lingual and labial surfaces of the teeth, you can have fully customized appliances. And I bet there are people who think, I don't need those. They're expensive, they're complicated, I can get good results without them. So what's changed in brackets? An awful lot. Several brackets have become completely extinct. There's interesting stories could be told about the introduction and development of ceramic brackets and lingual brackets, but we can't do 40 years in 45 minutes and cover all of that. So let's just go to the one at the bottom, which is a subject one or two of you may have been unfortunate enough to hear me natter on about in the past. These were all brackets except the one on the top right, which I used in the 1980s and before. The one on the top right, as a little footnote to history, is the edge lock bracket. And its place, I suppose, in orthodontics is that was the bracket that Dwight Damon used before he decided that there was something in this, but it needed a much better mousetrap to bring it out, and developed his series of brackets. This was Germany's best engineering, made by Harradine in the 1980s, a little rotating cam. It was the best that engineering could do in those days. It was pretty hopeless. It was very difficult to open and close. They came open by themselves. And when you see the narrowness of the labial aspect of the bracket, you don't need me to persuade you that the rotational control was very poor. This is one of my speed bracket cases from 1982. The speed bracket, of course, has survived and continued and has a dedicated following. It would not have done unless it had changed from this version. Dr. Hansen, who developed it, was pretty averse to the introduction of straight wire into this bracket. There was no straight wire element built into these. More importantly, although more subtly, because that first change was bound to come, there was no little restraining clip to stop the spring being deflected out. So the wire came out of the bracket the whole time. So things do need to evolve, even if they turn out to be successful. This Activa bracket was developed by Erwin Pletcher. Strange looking bracket because it had no tie wings. That's quite logical if you've got a self-ligating bracket, but it led to all sorts of problems. Tie wings are not just useful for ligation and for elastomeric chain, they also turned out to have a very useful role in enabling us to locate a bracket on the tooth because we were visually familiar with that. So people found it difficult to get the brackets where they wanted, and also the rigidity of the metal involved in joining the tie wings to the base of the bracket was hugely important in resisting slight flexion of the bracket. And of course, slight flexion to a bracket through any orthodontic force is death to the bond, because that's how we get bonds off. So they came off a lot. Nevertheless, they did show some of the things which, if you'd ever used the Begg technique, you were a bit more familiar with. The team seemed to move easier and quicker and to a respectable result. And you can see in this case here, that I'm starting to break the rules, be a bit more Begg-like. If you did that with conventional brackets, the conventional teaching was and is that what will mainly happen is the upper incisor will move forwards and the canine may be extremely reluctant to move backwards. But if you have a bracket which resists that movement and makes light forces relatively more effective, then you may in 2 visits' time find you've got to there, and then the rotation also, because of those same biomechanical findings and facts, is more easy to derotate. So in the mid-1990s, this particular subfamily of brackets were good when they were good, but they were bad when they were bad. They were awkward to use, they tended to break, and they were expensive. And since then, of course, there's been an explosion of bracket types of this. I was lecturing in Brazil last year. 5,000 delegates was their lowest turnout for the conference for years because of the recession. There were 6 types of self-ligating bracket there, all made locally, all very popular because they're much cheaper, which I'd never even heard of. The brackets on the right hand of the screen are 2 of the ones I would never recommend even for use on a mother-in-law or a dog. It took a long time before brackets came along which tended to do what we wanted them to do, about 20 years really. You know, be easy to open and close, robustly stay closed, not clog up with calculus and things like that. Now, one of the things that complicates our reaction to anything new is the hype that tends to go with it. you can think of almost anything that has been introduced, and whoever's developed it thinks it is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And that also applied to these brackets. I would suggest that when you hear somebody talking about something which they have developed, you look at the results they're achieving more than the claims that they may make about how they're achieving those results. People may have introduced excellent functional appliances at moving teeth. They may make the main claim for them that they grow jaws at several millimeters a week, and that's why you should buy them. And you may take that with a pinch or a bucket, as David Byrne said, of sodium chloride, but look at it and say, well, it seems to be pretty good at moving the teeth. So take the bits that fit with your existing knowledge. And I would gently say, with all due respect, that the originators of what often turn out to be very good ideas are not necessarily the best interpreters of their creations. I don't think you should take as gospel everything that these people say about their creations. You should look at them with your own eyes. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be hugely grateful to these usually very persistent people who develop things like the straight wire appliance or a better functional appliance or anything. So we have to hugely be grateful for their energy, but not necessarily take everything they say about their creation as gospel. Where are we now with this particular category of brackets? Well, the bits in white are proved, but it's the bits in gold that are quite a common combination in orthodontics. There has been increasingly impressive laboratory data due to increasing sophistication in our ability to model in vitro the in vivo situation, that these brackets produce a better force system, responds better to lighter forces, but absolutely no random controlled trial showing they're any better at all. And this combination is shared by things such as the straight wire appliance and nickel titanium wires. It's quite a common one. We all see the graphs about nickel titanium wires, but no random controlled trial, and there have been several, has ever yet shown that they're any better. And so I thought it would be worth just spending a couple of minutes talking about the evolution of research methods, and I didn't know when I thought this was worth a couple of minutes that there was going to be such an excellent talk about all this morning with Sabine Roof and David Byrne. Years and years ago, you know, when I was born into orthodontics, this was a very popular form of research in inverted commas report. Case reports are a very low robustness in terms of evidence, but I wouldn't dismiss them altogether. It only took 2 case reports of eyes being blinded by headgear for the whole world to change what it did with headgear. So they still have a place. Most evidence over the years, especially then and still to an extent now, were produced by case series with controls or without controls, and the whole value of those depends on what sort of series, on what sort of control. If they're warts and all consecutively started cases, that's worth a lot more than a very random and conveniently assembled group. And the same with the controls. Laboratory tests have improved hugely over the years. We're all very familiar now with the introduction of computer modeling and electronic measurement. But to take an example which most people in this room will not be aware of, but it's very fundamental. 30 years ago, Professor Norman Waters, who was a professor in material sciences, was persuaded by Bill Houston, the professor of orthodontics at the Royal Dental, to turn his formidable brain pound to orthodontics. And we all have seen stress-strain curves with wires, you know, and they have a modulus spasticity and they flatten off the top, and you can compare wires. And when Norman said, well, how are these graphs obtained? He said, well, it's, you know, a bit like in physics lessons that, you know, you hang up a wire and you put a weight on it and you stretch it and you measure how much weight and how much stretch. And he said, but that's all right for mine shafts and suspension bridges, but you don't stretch wire in orthodontics, do you? Well, no. Well, that's not a realistic test for in vivo conditions, is it? Well, no. So he developed a whole series of standardized mandrels around which wires were wrapped, much more closely mimic what we do in the mouth. And all the more recent research ever done on the stress strain curves of wires have all used that method. So I just say that that's a thing lost in the mist of history, but it shows that laboratory tests depend hugely on how accurately they model in vivo conditions. And there have been huge improvements with that. And that, of course, brings us to random controlled trials. 40 years ago, they were almost non-existent. I can only think of one in orthodontics before that, done in 1967, actually, when I published a random controlled trial on the long-term effects on incisor regularity of extracting wisdom teeth in the early 90s and eventually got it published, because it does take a time, it was all alone. What's a random control trial doing in orthodontics sort of thing? They were drug trial things, weren't they? And then, of course, an explosion, and rightly so, of random control trials in orthodontics, several of which I took part in and was a co-author. And till we reached a point about 10 years ago, and this was covered at greater length and probably greater eloquence this morning in the session for those of you who were here. But about 10 years ago, I think there was a general feeling about random control trials and their place. There were two important things. And the first thing was no evidence except random control trials, whatever, was worth anything. And the second was, if something's been shown in a random control trial, it's on tablets of stone. It's come down from Sinai. It's gospel. And since then, of course, there has been a growing realization, which was reflected in the discussion this morning, that neither of those are quite true, that they are extremely valuable tools in making sure we're, as much as we can, comparing like with like, but they are much more difficult to do in orthodontics than you would think, to ask the right question in the right way. And so, for example, if I take a good, recent random control trial in self-ligating bracket field, which is what we've been talking about, done by Goldie, Songra, and others, what they found, same as every other random control trial, is that they were no better or quicker than standard brackets. If we look at their methodology, this was a little bit unintuitive. Why would you choose 12-week appointment intervals for self-ligating patients as opposed to 6 weeks? Bit counterintuitive. After all, if they're meant to move teeth quicker, wouldn't you see patients more often? And the reason was, completely defendable, that this was the recommendation in the manufacturer's literature at the time for those brackets, which is a reflection of what I said earlier, that the people who make and sell innovations aren't necessarily the repositories of the biggest wisdom about their own products. This was not a sensible appointment interval, but it was what the manufacturers had overinterpreted from the general feeling that you must let things work gently. They did find one difference. This is a direct quote from his thesis, that on average, patients were in the chair for 50 minutes longer with the standard brackets. So you can put that into English, that straight self-ligating brackets gave the same qualitative result in the same treatment time with 50 minutes less time in the chair. Now, this is a random control trial, so this must be absolute truth and generalizable, but of course it isn't necessarily. It may be, but what would happen if you treated them both with 12-week intervals, or both with 6-week intervals, or if you actually treated them both with mechanics which were designed around self-ligating brackets as opposed to conventional brackets? Well, there's no such thing as a perfect study that doesn't need to be built on, so the simple answer is you do another random controlled trial. You use the same appointment level, you use optimal mechanics as suggested by the very good laboratory data, and you use clinicians who are equally expert with both techniques. That's not always easy to find. There are several people here today who, like me, took part in a good random controlled trial comparing Herbst appliances with twin block appliances. The Herbst appliances were the first and usually the last that we ever treated, which wasn't necessarily particularly fair. It may not have altered the results, but nevertheless, it's a factor that people could point at as possibly affecting the results. Why not immediately do another random control trial? Because they are lengthy, they are wearing, they are tiring, they are expensive. If somebody here has an idea today of a random controlled trial that they want to do, and they go home tonight and they start working on it, it will be at least 5 years before they've got a publication out of it. And when people do research, they do, of course, want to add to the body of knowledge. They also, totally understandably, want to add to the body of their curriculum vitae. And they don't necessarily want to wait 5 years and to do all the procedure, which, if you heard Tony Ireland's talk today, can be pretty wearing and tiring and lengthy. And the problem with a long study is, particularly of an innovation, that during that time, knowledge keeps advancing. The product you're testing may keep advancing, may now be obsolete. It took a long time for me, with these particular little brackets, to realize, appreciate, articulate, and express how best we might take advantage of what was in itself ever improving and increasing laboratory evidence about their performance. So random controlled trials are great, but they are difficult. And they are not necessarily gospel. And like everything else, they have to be examined with common sense and with our knowledge. So there have been changing perspectives on research methodology. I'm just going to step aside 1 second to echo what was several times said this morning about the BOSF, the British Orthodontic Society Foundation. I was just thinking, sitting there, that whatever I've managed to do in my job, treating patients or giving talks, actually the idea of creating, and then I did create and was the first chairman of the BOSF, may turn out over the next 40 years to be much more useful than anything else I've done during the last 40 years. And I would urge you, I'm a retired orthodontist now, I still contribute to the foundation I founded, and I would urge everybody of you to do so, so that the research that is done is as good as possible for our specialty and for the patients we treat. Now, I'm now going to show you a case report, having said how important RCTs are, because I'm not alone in thinking that random controlled trials are challenging, difficult, and tiring, because here we are. When I was in Ireland, I saw that a very well-known author of random controlled trials had obviously felt they were sufficiently difficult that he wanted to diversify. You'll be pleased to see at the top there, he's proud of having the largest ferry. Size isn't necessarily everything. You may disagree or disapprove of his choice of the name for this boat, the MV Happy Hooker. I can only say that I wish Kevin every luck with this diversification, but I hope it doesn't distract him too much from his excellent role within orthodontics of providing future research. Arch wires have changed a little bit over the years. This wasn't actually an arch wire I bent, although we were pretty good in those days at bending complicated arch wires. It was a transfer case from America. They were trying to torque in the roots of those upper canines. It did take quite a time to bend wires. The biggest major change, of course, has been the introduction of this new alloy. I should think most orthodontic arch wires now are nickel titanium. It may surprise those of you who weren't around when these were born that the earlier wires were very mixed in their beneficial effects. They had a high breakage rate. You were always coming back with them broken, and they were very expensive. So expensive we used to autoclave them and use them again if we could find a patient of the same length. And probably everybody in this audience under 40 had no idea about that. They were not an instant, wonderful thing. And although I think it would be possible to devise a random controlled trial to show that they were better, it is clearly not easy. Everybody in this room thinks they are better than the equivalent other products. But there's absolutely no robust evidence. And probably no one can be bothered to try and find it. They just take it as read. But it is worth putting in perspective our overall evidence-based changes. They're not always evidence-based, even if they're good. What about anchorage devices? Well, we fitted thousands and thousands and thousands of those. I can't remember the last time I personally fitted a headgear. We had to change to more security inside and outside the mouth as a result of those case reports I talked about. Of course, you needed cooperation. We were good those days at putting them on, slick at putting them on, familiar with putting them on, slick at selling them to patients, and they were used to other people having them and all sorts of other things. You did need good cooperation, and ideally, ladies and gentlemen, you needed patients who would wear them in the daytime, and they did exist. I don't know who the fellow on the left is, but that's Dave Brown, Chris Stevens, and Ian Hawthorne, who, apart from being absolutely wonderful contributors to our profession, were, when the need arose, excellent daytime headgear wearers. So why are we using no headgear these days? Well, there's a whole raft of contributing factors here, each one of which is worth consideration. I would just point out the discluding the bite to, in one sentence, say if you're not usually using bite ramps, if the bite is increased or the same, I think you're missing a trick. But mainly, of course, the big innovation is temporary anchorage devices, which didn't exist at all. And this study was referred to earlier by Sabine. And it was an excellent random controlled trial using a precursor of mini screws, and they were all successful. The TADs, they all stayed in, and they all worked. And you might have thought that the result of this random controlled trial would be that the new cooperation-free technology was infinitely superior to the old-fashioned cooperation-demanding headgear, and you'd be wrong. That was as good as the result could be. And the reason, as was covered in the session this morning, is that, of course, people knew they were in the trial. They and their clinicians were busting their gut because their results were on the line and going to be scrutinized in infinite detail. And the Hawthorne effect, of course, was contributing and may contribute today in studies on, for example, reversible headgear. You may get better results in a study. And as somebody said, maybe everybody should be put in a study to get the Hawthorne effect for all our patients. Nevertheless, in spite of an absence of robust evidence, there is little doubt in most people's mind that these are a tremendous advance. This hypodontia patient, I needed to move the canines forward a whole unit and the molars forward a whole unit, and the incisors mustn't go back a millimetre. It's possible with reversible headgear I might have been able to achieve that, but actually with absolutely no cooperation from the patient at all, that was easy peasy, and they could make some bridges. And this patient came and had skeletal causation for both the anterior open bite and the substantial midline deviation. Said, I'm not having any operation. Can you do anything to get my teeth to meet? And I said, well, perhaps I can now. So we intruded the molars with mini screws, and then we thought we needed 100% anchorage reinforcement. And I don't think before the advent of temporary anchorage devices that would have been at all possible in orthodontics. So like everything else, they're not perfect, and especially when they come in and they're new to you and you are new to them, they're not perfect. They have undoubtedly enormously increased the scope of orthodontics over those 40 years, and we wouldn't ever want to go back to not having them. Now, I thought at this stage I would share with you a picture I took of an undergraduate 35 years ago into whom I was trying to instill some orthodontic knowledge. And I don't think James Spencer's changed very much over the years, has he? And my point of showing you this is to say that if you're teaching somebody and they seem to have less than maximum respect for their elders and quite clearly betters, don't let that make you too pessimistic about their long-term career. People like James, in fact James himself, can turn out to be a pillar of the orthodontic profession, a secretary of the Church Consultant Orthodontic Group, a chairman of this absolute conference itself, and a pillar of postgraduate education on the other side of the Pennines in another northern powerhouse. So don't be too discouraged. Functional appliances, of course, when I started in orthodontics, this gets a bit Monty Python, you know. We used to wake up in the morning before we'd gone to bed, lick the roads clean with a you youngsters don't know you were born, you know. Well, apart from that, they were all solid blocks of acrylic, like hydration appliances, very hard to wear. Then a twin block appliance came along, that seemed much better, although again, there's no study to show that people wear it more than other appliances, but everyone, and I myself would be included in that, think that they are better. But now, well, I would say, until I stopped work last year, I still use twin blocks on some younger patients, but these molar-to-molar appliances seem to be the way forward. And so we have to sort of think, well, how have we reacted to previous innovations and how should we react to this one? For those of you who haven't tried some of these, their unique selling point, these molar-to-molar appliances, is that you can start everything at once. So here's a patient, took out the supernumerary lateral, that's the first visit. Second, third, fourth, seem to have cured most of it. Put on the bonds, settle it in, take the bonds off. So from there to there. We're using the sequential functional then fix. I personally almost never got out under 2 years by the time you'd had the gap between one appliance and another. These appliances, like every single new appliance, aren't perfect when they're introduced, and nor you when you start using them. But I would suggest they're the way forward, and there is, interestingly, at the moment, an excellently designed, as far as everyone can tell, random control trial being done by John Macon and Tajik Gill. So in 5 years' time, we'll have some more robust evidence about this appliance. You may feel you need to make up your mind as to whether this is a goer or not quicker than 5 years. So overall, in 40 years, what's changed? Because the tools of the trade have changed, orthodontic appliances. I think you can sum it up by saying it is much simpler, easier, less conspicuous, more comfortable, and less chairside time, even if treatments yet haven't been shown to be consistently shorter. And the result of that is that treatment is much more available and more acceptable to patients, and good results are more consistently achieved. As you have seen, it's only anecdotal, but we've always been able to produce good results with whatever appliance. It's just that modern appliances make it more easy to more consistently achieve them. And overall, what's changed in 40 years? Well, I have to say almost everything. Can't think of anything that we do now in terms of where we're heading, how we're getting there, the background against which we're treating, the way we're researching, that hasn't almost completely changed. That's one of the attractions of it, really. But, should I dance? But almost everything changed, including the musical background. But I think there are some factors which act against potentially good changes, which delay their introduction or their widespread acceptance. And the first is that absolutely all examples of innovations which turn out to be good almost always need improvement, either in the design of the innovation or in our usage and understanding of them, or both. Nickel titanium wires, we've talked about them. Self-ligating brackets, the first ones were large, a bit soft, not the right prescriptions. Mini screws, after the first 12 I put in, 6 fell out. So the last 30 I put in, none fell out. They'd got better, but more importantly, I'd got better because of things that other people had found out about where was best to put them and how best to put them in. And the knowledge will continue to advance in that too. Advanced sync, we've talked about. And the second thing is that if you want to wait for really good clinical evidence before you change your practice, you're probably never going to change. Or it's going to be ever so long time before you do change. Both of those two are therefore quite powerful reasons for not changing what you do. I tried one of those and it broke. Well, I'm not going to do that. There's no evidence it's any good. But more powerful than either of those, I think, is an innate human characteristic. And in orthodontics, it's expressed like this. Well, look, in orthodontics, almost everything works, so why should I change? Nigel stands up there. You can get a good result with a beg bracket, an edgewise bracket, this sort of appliance. I can get good results. So you may listen after me to what Chris or Sabine or Simon says and say, I bet there'll be something. That's new. It was new to me. Haven't seen that. Looks rather good. Seems to fit with what I already know. I should try that. Yeah, it looks a good idea. And then on Monday morning, you're faced with a whole day full of patients, and you think, well, maybe I won't try it today because I want to get through the whole day. And I know my normal tricks, and I get good results. So I won't change yet. It's a long time since I've been out of my comfort zone, and I don't want to be out of my comfort zone on Monday morning, and so you don't get around to change. And that attitude, that frame of mind, that way of thinking has actually been researched. Edward de Bono, you probably mainly associate with his concept, coining the phrase and researching into lateral thinking, thinking outside the box. But he's also researched this, because it applies not just in orthodontics. Well, what I do, I'm good at. I've learned the skills, I'm comfortable at it, I can turn up, I can do my job in a pretty stress-free way. Why should I change? And what Edward de Bono calls this, in a rather memorable phrase, I think, is being imprisoned by competence. Because you're good at something, you keep doing it. And you're reluctant to go back to the frame of mind you had when you started your specialist training and someone said, put these brackets on, and you thought, Of course, you won't go back that far in anything you do to change, but even the slightest change is risking breaking out of the prison that your competence is keeping you in. And I would urge everybody here, whatever they hear from Chris or Sabine or Simon this afternoon, that seems to be a good idea, good enough for you to try it and to persist with it a bit, because you need to, not to be imprisoned by your current competence. Well, this is Chris Chang. And you can see he's consoling me. He's got an arm around my shoulder. And I can tell you, because I remember now, he's commiserating with me about the poverty of my wristwatch. Why have you got such a cheap wristwatch, he said. And I was trying to explain that I was just a, poor salaried or British orthodontist, and I couldn't afford a Rolex. And beside, my watch told the time perfectly, and Chris said that's nothing to do with it. So anyway, what I would say is that if you haven't heard Chris talk, you've missed something. And even if you have heard Chris talk, I know if you have, you'll stay and listen to Chris, who follows on, and I bet he will say something which is new to you. Makes you think, I don't do that, should I? So don't be imprisoned by your current competence when that comes along. So finally, having said that almost everything has changed in orthodontics, what hasn't changed? Well, I think what hasn't changed is this. It's still really, really enjoyable, really privileged to be part of. Nobody turns up and says, oh, God, why am I an orthodontist, I mean, we all have our troubles and our trials, and maybe the patients, the system, the weather, whatever it is. But this is still true. And one of the things that makes it true is the continual change. So, for the 607th time and final time, thank you for coming along. If you have been, thank you for listening. And I just hope that something that I've said about the past 40 years helps you with considering changes over the next 40 years. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.